Hello, and welcome to the Astrology Hub podcast. My name's Amanda Poole-Walsh, and I'm the founder of Astrology Hub and the host of this podcast. And today's episode is a bonus Christmas episode with Gemini Brett to answer the questions so many of us astrology lovers have. What is the real ancient meaning behind many of our modern traditions around Christmas time? Now, if you don't know Gemini Brett, you are in for a real treat. He is a modern mystic and shamanic astrologer who lives in Seattle, unless he's out taking groups of people to explore the world's mysteries at the sacred sites. Gemini Brett calls himself a storyteller, and by the time you've heard this episode, you will not wonder why. Now, if you're sitting around with the kiddos, you might want to pause and listen to this later. This episode is best for teens and up for this story time session. But if you're ready to unlock the deeper magic in Christmas, this episode is for you. Have you ever felt that many of our modern celebrations have astrological and astronomical roots? Well, I have, and as it turns out, Christmas is no exception. I personally found it healing to reconnect to Christmas through this lens. You're going to love this episode. If you've ever wondered, why do we bring evergreen trees into our home in December? And why do we put a star at the top? Is December 25th really the birth of Christ, or is it the return of the light? Is Christ the sun, S-U-N, or the sun, S-O-N? Why do people kiss under the mistletoe? And does that relate to Jupiter or Saturn? And why is Santa from the North Pole? Gemini Brett leaves no stone unturned. In this episode, you're going to hear about Santa Claus's shamanic roots relating to the ritual and healing with the Amanita muscaria mushroom, how the Roman Empire was able to spread through assimilation rather than destruction alone. What the heck is Saturnalia? And why is Christmas so subdued today in reaction to it? And is it possible that the sun and the 12 apostles is really just the sun moving through the zodiac in one year? And the most important one, the question that's on all of your minds, how the heck does Santa get those presents to every single kid in just 24 hours? And how does that relate to what's happening in the sky? All right, you guys, we're going to go down the rabbit hole into this astronomical story of Christmas. And while this is probably a different kind of tale that you gathered around the fireplace to hear when you were a child, it's equally mesmerizing and even more magical. Let's give our full attention to the genius that is Gemini Brett. Brett, it is wonderful to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for joining us for this special edition of the Astrology Hub podcast on the astrological origins of Christmas.
Ho, ho, ho.
You know, Brett, I am on this kick, and it started last year when Christmas was this like the buildup was awesome, you know, the decorating and the time with the kids and all those like pre-Christmas events I loved. But then the actual event of Christmas, I was like, whoa, like, is this it? You know, is it really just this? Because if this is it, then I'm like not that into it. I need more meaning and like soul and connection. And that's just been hard to find. So to have you here talking about the astrological underpinnings of this celebration that we have every year is really healing, actually, for me. And what I could probably predict is that it will be for other people as well. And just reconnect us to the magic and the mystery and the fun of this time of year and of this particular celebration. So thank you for being with us.
You're quite welcome, and I'm very excited to speak Christmas mysteries as I am these days. I want to give a little warning to parents out there that might be listening with little ones. This will be a different type of the expression of the magic and the twinkle, and won't do service to some of the story that the young ones are holding dear to their hearts. So this podcast episode is not for them. I don't want to be the guy that takes magic and mystery away from anyone. I want to bring more of it.
Absolutely. So I guess what age? Oh, wow. Do you hear that deer?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I think it's a reindeer.
We have a reindeer, you guys. There's already magic. Okay.
A reindeer meowing.
It's the male like calling for his troop. I love it. Okay.
He's like, on Blitzen, on Ditzen.
Yes, exactly. Okay, Brett. So tell us, like, what is the astrological story here?
Well, astrological in that what astrology truly is the bridge of sacred science that connects astronomy and correspondences, because this is much more, I think, an astronomical story, though astrology is an astronomical story. Although I will share a wonderful thing about astrology that came in while you were just speaking about the build up to Christmas. We often use this to describe the difference between an applying aspect in astrology versus separating. So applying is about to happen, and separating, the aspect is already perfected and it's moving. And the great analogy is it's like waiting to figure out what's under the tree for you. And the kids are so excited. And that's the applying aspect. And then the separating aspect is like, cool, I got that hoverboard I really wanted. And then it just kind of gathers dust, you know? So, yeah, I mean, I really came into this, what I call the second level of the Christmas mysteries, right when I heard that my nephew was on the verge of his own December awakening. But actually, it started with the tooth fairy for him, because he had a guest over and the guest lost a tooth. And my nephew Kyle was like, dude, you're stoked. It's a molar. Molars are $5. And then my sister overheard this and she's like, different tooth fairies have like different economic systems, because she didn't want to lay this trip on this kid's parents that they had to give $5 for his molar, right? And so Kyle and his friend disappear into the room. And like 15 minutes later, he pops out and he's like, Mom, I'm going to ask you something and I want you to tell me the truth. Are you the tooth fairy? And she said, yeah. And he goes, y ratoncito también, because they lived in Spain for a while. And in Spain, instead of a fairy, they have ratoncito Perez, who is a little rat that comes and gives you money for your tooth, right? She said, yeah, yo estoy, or yo soy ratoncito también. And this was right around Easter time. And they had just been to the big local like Easter egg thing. And he's like, in the bunny? And she said, yeah. He's like, all those people, all those people are just lying? And she said, well, it's, not. And he's like, oh, I don't even want to ask about the big guy. And he closes the door, right, with fury. And that was it. And then the crazy thing was Christmas came around and he was fully Santa'd up. There was like literally, he didn't want to ask about the big guy. He wasn't going there. He wasn't like going to dispel like his favorite piece of the Christmas magic, Santa Claus, right? Which I actually find completely admirable on one level, and on another level, like amazing metaphor for being asleep to the whole control system that runs this world and creates things like consumerism Christmas.
Totally. Brett, I struggled with my two little girls. It was like, do I perpetuate the thing? Because I remember finding out about Santa as being one of those defining moments of thinking, well, if that magic isn't real, maybe all magic isn't real. That's
the issue, right? So that's the significant issue. I mean, for me, it was like literally, I was at my grandmother's house and it was like a TV show. I think it was The Facts of Life, where one of the characters was being ridiculed for still believing in Santa. And I looked at my sister and I was like, really? And she's like, yeah, you idiot. And that was it, And then I'm not aware of it at the time, but I think you're exactly right. And from what I remember, your kids are at Waldorf school, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, where there's so much emphasis in the Steiner system on keeping the mystery and the myth alive. And that, especially in those first 7 years, which interestingly is a Santa period, right? The Saturn square, the Santa square Santa happens when you're about 7 years old. And we need to stay in the mystery, right? I mean, that's like, the child comes in with more wisdom than the elder has. And this is one of the reasons why the baby's not allowed to speak, right? Because if they share that with those who have been coaxed to sleep, and that means adults, then it will shatter this whole thing that is our so-called reality. So it's kind of one of the great galactic giggles that you bring in the wise sage in the baby's body that doesn't have language to share until,
Oh my gosh, totally. Well, Brett, the beautiful thing is that astrology is what brought the magic back for me. So it was, Santa and all those things kind of making me think, well, maybe there is no magic, but then it was astrology bringing the magic back. And that again is why I'm excited for adults to connect in with the astrological story in the sky, but also for them to be able to share that, as our kids go through that rite of passage. That story is a metaphor for abundance, for generosity, however you want to position it. But this is, like you said, a second level of the mystery. This is what you get to graduate into, is this story. And so that's why I'm so excited to share it.
Yeah. And then there's level 3, by the way.
Ooh, yay. but we won't get there today. Maybe next year.
So we'll even kind of maybe tease that one first. That's where I want to bring the kids. So my whole, this whole thing is about, wait a second, like, let's make sure that kind of like in a mystery school tradition, when somebody breaks through the first level, and in this case, it would be saying, oh, this like Santa story is like not true. It's like, yeah, you're right. And now you're ready for level 2. So let me tell you what the truth is, right? And then when they break out of that, which is actually in that level, understanding that, as it should be with level 1, I think level 4 is we go back to level 1, we go back to the Santa thing and really connect to its deep roots. But before we can, we need to learn about the tree and about the sun, which in the church they call the Christ, right? So I would just share, this is not my mystery tradition for the Christmas kids and adults, but a dear friend of mine has this thing where when his kids broke through, he said, oh, cool, now you've been initiated, now you can be a Santa. Like, what's a Santa? It's like, well, we need to give a gift to somebody who doesn't even know they're getting it from us. Because that's what St. Nick did. He just showed up and left golden boots, you know? So who in the neighborhood needs something? It's like, oh, yeah, you know, Miss Clark on the corner, she's getting so old and she gets her newspaper in her bare feet every day. She needs slippers. And then so he goes with his kid, like on the ninja mission in the middle of the night and leaves slippers on the doorstep, right?
That's adorable. I like that.
Yeah, that's adorable and beautiful. And this cat has all sorts of really cool parent magic like that. But for me, I really want to tune kids into the mysteries of the seasonal shifts, you know. And so I was all ready to do that one year. And I was like, because we had started having some solstice ceremonies. And I was like, okay, kids, tell me what Christmas is about, you know. And idiotically thinking I might hear something about the birth of Christ. And that's, of course, not what went down.
I already know what they were talking about.
Yeah, tell us what I heard from the kids.
You heard it's about getting gifts, pretty much.
Yeah, and specifically from who?
From Santa.
And where does Santa come into the home from?
Yes, comes from the North Pole and drops off gifts, and that's what Christmas is about.
Right, rides with a sleigh pulled by 8 magical reindeer. Sometimes now we have Rudolph with the red nose in the front to clear the fog, and comes and puts nice things in the stockings, or coal if you've been naughty, and leaves some gifts in pretty paper wrapped under the tree. And you leave an offering, which is actually a really beautiful thing of even the modern situation, right? You leave, I mean, the wish list is an interesting thing, and like, we're not doing it right, but it is kind of training a little bit of like the manifestation, right? Wish list, intention setting, which is good. And then leaving the cookies and the carrots for Santa and the reindeer. Like, to me, that's a beautiful thing. I was just in Egypt, and carved into the walls of every temple, you see, you know, Pharaoh and the others offering incense, you know, probably gold and myrrh, right, to the Neteru, to the so-called gods and goddesses. And that's, I think, a really beautiful part that we want to preserve, right? So I see a lot in this thing. It's like, okay, well, let's keep some of that. And then, of course, I'm always trying to find ways to get the kids interested in the stars. In this tradition, it's so much about the stars. So, well, the second thing I get out of them after the whole Santa situation is the tree with the star on top and decorating the tree. And then I have to like ask a lot more questions to get anywhere close to what they would hear were they to go to a church, right? Where this day is all about Christ's birth. So, I mean, let's just get into the truth that Christ called himself the Son of Man. And English is a really fun game with these homonyms we have. And it's a pretty new language. It's actually a language that's even younger than the time when Christmas Day was first assigned to the birth of Christ, which didn't go down till like early 300 AD, right? I mean, there's no mention of December or anything in the Bible. There's no date assigned to Christ's birth. So, I mean, in fact, we hear that the shepherds were out with their sheep, which probably is not happening in Jerusalem on December 25th, or Bethlehem for that matter. So the idea of the sun with the 12 apostles, this is, of course, the sun's annual movement through the 12 zodiac signs, right? I mean, a very clear image is Thomas, whose name is Didymus Thomas, and Didymus means twins, and Thomas means twins. In other words, that's the cat that you and I have come to call Gemini, right?
And does it track like that? Like, can you sort of equate the characteristics or the names of many of the apostles with the zodiac signs?
Many have gone for it. I'm not enough of a biblical scholar to like really say that I have merit trying. There's not as simple like etymological links for all of them like that. But it's a really great game to play. And it's something I really encourage for clients of mine who grew up in like more of a confined system where they had to break out of a religiosity and are really having a hard time coming to astrology because they were taught it was devil worship or whatever in the church when they were young. I often encourage them to read the Bible again and try to do it with new eyes, because there is a lot of astrology and certainly a lot of astronomy and mystery in the Bible, including very likely why in modern times we assign the birth of Christ to Christmas Day, because in the northern hemisphere, like in Jerusalem, Bethlehem, this is the return of the light, right after the longest night. Winter solstice, December 21st in the current calendar. The sun stays at its most southern rise and its most southern set for a few days. And it's really the 25th when the sun starts climbing the mountain again.
So that is true. So pretty much like every year, the 25th is the day that after the solstice where the sun comes back for a longer duration of time.
Yeah, right around that. I mean, it takes a while. Solstice means the sun stops. And the Greek term is tropikos, which is the same word from which the tropical zodiac is named. Tropikos means turn around. So the sun, if you watch the sun rise every year, or as you can from your lanai now, watch it set every day throughout the course of the year, you'll see that the equinox sun sets due west, and let's say March equinox, then it's traveling further south until it gets to 0 degrees tropical Cancer at June solstice. You can just look at the Cancer glyph. It's literally showing the sun traveling in one direction for 6 months and then stopping and turning around and going the other way. So at June solstice, the sun starts traveling south, and at December solstice, it's at its southernmost reach. And for the northern hemisphere, the lowest midday sun in the sky, right? And then it takes a few days because it's a really terrible name, but they called them suicides when I was in like PE class, which is like running as fast as you can and stopping and turning around and running back, right? So think about that exercise. And sorry to bring in that terrible name, but probably many people know it by that. Obviously, when you're stopped, and you're moving fastest, right? Like halfway between your stopping points. The sun does this on the horizon. So at the solstice, it's literally stopped. The sun stops. And at the equinox times, the sun is just flying day after day. So I really encourage you to check this out. I'm really happy that I'll be moving to a house soon where we have a view of the sunsets throughout the year. So one of the great ways to connect to the sacred astronomy is to keep like a horizon calendar. Because when the sun moves into Taurus, it's going to set in a very unique place of the mountain over there, or on that house or church over there, or whatever it will be. And then there's another day of the year when it comes back, and that could bring us into Antisha, but this isn't about astrology. This is about Christmas. So I say, okay, well, these guys aren't ready for like the whole Christ scene, because we should be talking about the rebirthing of the light and why we bring the evergreen tree into the house and why we have a feast. And, actually, let's do that now. I want to read a little bit from the great poem by Clement C. Moore, in which kind of the modern image of Santa Claus was born. And this is from 1822, New York City. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all covered in ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes, how they twinkled, his dimples, how merry, his cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard on his chin was as white as the snow. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke it encircled his head like a wreath. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself.
Brett, can I tell you real quick? My brother, I have 3 brothers, and we would sit on nestle around my dad and listen to that story every Christmas Eve. Every Christmas Eve, it was like our little tradition. And so just hearing you say that now, like brings back so many memories, like taste and smells and sounds and all of it. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you for sharing that in my house as well, right? It was a night before Christmas. And see those like memories and those sounds and those smells and that smile in your heart that just happened. We do not want to do away with that, right? These are the same things we're going for in the old festivals of old. And maybe even to a higher level. And there's all sorts of interesting traditions tied up with solstice ceremonies, which is what Christmas is. And if we could remember that that's what it was, right? So and we see a lot of symbols here, like the smoke encircling his head, that like a wreath. Right? That's pretty interesting. And even that he's smoking a pipe, which is kind of new on the Santa scene. But if you've ever sat in original people ceremonies from the land where I live in, now called America, like tobacco is a very important, plant in the shamanic traditions here. And there's a lot of shamanic tradition tied into the Santa story. So we hear some other interesting things here, the beard like the snow, and basically so are his robes, but also covered in ashes and soot. And we'll see the white and the black really kind of heavily favored, and also the red and the green, which we'll get back into. But I think very importantly here is that he's jolly because he's chubby and fat, right? And that is a rarity on the longest night. When you're talking about cultures from thousands of years ago, I mean, at this point of the year, it's about, are we going to survive? Will we make it through? And the prayers aren't only for the fertility of your tribe, and they certainly are. I mean, like all of the so-called pagan equinox, solstice, cross-quarter holidays like Samhain, Beltane, like this is a celebration that is connected to fertility. So, I mean, actually one image of the red and the white, heavy for some, is the blood and the semen. I could talk about bells and candles as well, but let's just leave it there. That's one image of fertility, if you will. But we need to pray also for the fertility of the animals who are going to feed us and see us through the depths of the winter time. And in the northern traditions, and there's a very good reason why Santa's from the North Pole, we'll get back to that. There's actually many, but there's a very important star reason why Santa's from the North Pole. We're talking about reindeer, right? I mean, that's the principal food through the course of the winter, many of the really northern kind of Scandinavian parts, and certainly in Siberia as well, which is where it seems like a lot of the shamanic ties of Santa come from. So I'm going to rap about that because a lot of people have heard about Santa Shaman. And the idea is that he wears red and white because he's meant to look like the Amida muscara mushroom, which is basically that beautiful red and white polka dotted mushroom that looks like the Smurfs' houses, and it's said that is an important plant medicine in Siberian shamanism traditions. The word shaman itself actually comes to us from Siberia. It, in a sense, originally would describe a very kind of specific shamanic tradition, and now we use it globally, right, to describe kind of any shamanic tradition, right, because it has just become this word. But as it's told, and I can't confirm this myself because I've never spent time up there, and even if I did, I don't know that I would be allowed into the inner circle, if you will. But it's said that there's a very strong kind of mushroom shamanism, and that this red and white mushroom is kind of the principal vehicle. Some have even claimed that because it's difficult to receive visions by eating that mushroom, it's actually better if it's been processed. And so drinking urine after it's been eaten is a path, again, not something I can confirm. And then some people say that it's about having the reindeer eat the mushrooms and drinking the reindeer urine. And that feels like a stretch, but I've seen stranger things. That's for sure. So the general idea is up here.
So let me just back up for a sec.
Okay, go ahead. They always stop at the urine.
Let me just stop you right there. No, are we saying that Santa is a shaman?
We are saying here that at least much of the Santa mystery, including garb and other things, seem definitely tied to shamanic traditions.
Okay. And then we're saying that...
And I am also saying I cannot speak from experience.
Right. Okay. But we're looking at clues, and we're saying that the birth of Christ, the birth of the sun, is tied to the winter solstice and the sun actually coming back in the sky. And then we're saying that the reindeer, like why reindeer, right? But reindeer was a source of food for people.
And everything.
And everything.
Clothing, fat.
Okay.
Everything, right.
Okay, so one would, during the winter, be looking to spirit to help make sure that that food source and that resource was available all through the winter. So one might put together some sort of ceremony to appeal to the spirits to bring those things in, correct?
Absolutely. And then not only to spirit, but also to the vision keepers, right? So the shamans of the tribes are the one who are dreaming into the future to help us know how we would survive the cold and the darkness, right? I mean, there's stories of these shamans literally climbing trees or climbing the world tree. I'll get back to Odin in a bit because a lot of this is linked to him. But climbing trees for like the greater view of the horizons, you know, there's a really fascinating astronomical happening that far north where the sun never rises for many days in the winter, right? But you can see this almost cresting of the sun, or so I've been told. It's not something I've experienced, but it's the same thing. You know, if you go climb Haleakala in Maui, a very tall volcano, you're going to see the sun set much later than people down at sea level do. You know, altitude changes everything. So there's something about climbing the tree to have the vision of when the sun will be reborn, perhaps. But people that connect Santa to the Siberian shamanism trip not only say the red and white is because of this particular mushroom, but that also when you pick the mushrooms in the snow, you hang them in the trees to dry. So there's ornaments. You bring them inside and you hang them in stockings over the fire to dry more. So there's your stockings. And that because Santa can't come in the front door, it's snowed in, he uses the other door. I'm sorry, not Santa, shaman, which is the hole in the roof. Okay, so that's one of the threads that you'll hear. And I think it's super cool. And I love that it does connect Santa to this kind of very magical, shamanic, like seer being. I think that's a really important part of the thread. But I think a lot's also missing if we just stop there. Although there's one more thing I want to share is that shamans in that area of the world, and this is true also in China, Tibet, tend to use a lot of bells, like drums are used here, or in Hawaii, like bells are a very important part of the tradition for crossing over, for scaring demons away and such like that. So some say that the bells are linked there. Okay. So, but why also the red? Because Santa hasn't worn red for long. And it kind of got fixed into the tradition like in the 1930s after a Coca-Cola commercial displayed Santa in their colors.
Oh, wow. This is fascinating because my girls the other day were like, why red and green? Like, why do we even use those colors? And I was like, you know what? I have no idea. But that is really interesting.
Yeah, so it goes deeper than Coca-Cola. Although, you know, this holiday, which has become so consumerism, I think it's important for us to find some of those links and like massage them out of the stream a little bit. So Santa actually at some point wore green, and I'll read a little bit about that in a second. But let me speak about the red a little more. So yeah, this fertility bit of the blood, I mean, I don't think that we should ignore that because that's part of the old pagan tradition. And we see that in the holly and the ivy and the mistletoe, right? So mistletoe, very white berries, and the holly, the red. And again, you know, this is a fertility thing. This is probably why we kiss under the mistletoe, by the way. So.
Oh my gosh. Whoa. You're decoding so much.
Yeah. And the mistletoe was also known as the all healer plant to the Druid tradition, it is said, right? Which is interesting because it's actually a poisonous plant, but can be used in various ways. And it grows, you know, mistletoe is like a parasite, but it would grow in the oak, and that was the most sacred mistletoe because the oak was the most sacred tree. It's interesting, there's actually a debate by modern medical astrologers, at least I should say herbalist astrologers, of whether oak is corresponding with Jupiter or with Saturn. And most say Saturn, that's in what's in most of the books, but the Jupiter link seems to be where the Druids were at with the thing. And it's interesting too, most astrologers will like call Jupiter, I shouldn't say most astrologers, some astrologers call Jupiter Santa, which is like not my favorite. Anyway, but
well, you would say that Saturn is Santa?
Well, we do see the name a little more linked to Saturn, but really Santa comes from saint, And that links back to St. Nicholas, who we'll speak more about too. But Saturn also was, the one who was revered at Saturnalia, which was the Roman ceremony around this time of solstice. And it was a long ceremony. It was an amazing tradition that included little caps, Phrygian caps, they're called. You see them on in DC a lot. They're like the freedom cap or the liberty cap, which is interesting because there's another name that's also applied to psychedelic mushrooms. But it said that part of the Saturnalia tradition is that the servants or the slaves would become the boss for a week or two. But it was mostly known to have been just a completely raging, drunken stupor party where actually law was suspended. And Christmas, was suspended. After it had gotten hot in Europe, the Puritans fully shut it down. In the early days in the United States, well, before it was the United States and the colonies here, people would be fined for celebrating Christmas. And then in the early days of New York, when it was New Amsterdam, or was it New Holland? I think it was New Amsterdam. People would just get trashed and vandalized. And so part of the modern image of Christmas was actually carefully crafted to distract people's raging party vibes into something more celebratory that was a little safer on the streets.
A little more wholesome, huh?
Yeah, I guess. And then gift giving became so important. And this is linked to not only to Saturnalia, it brings us back to St. Nicholas. Let's talk about St. Nick a little bit. He's a Turkish bishop from the 400s and was the bishop in Myra for a long time. And he was known for being an amazing gift giver and that he would sneak attack gifts and go ninja style and just leave presents. And people would leave boots out and he would fill them with coins and other things. So a lot of the Santa and Christmas gift-giving tradition and the way that Santa Claus has been linked to St. Nick, that goes to St. Nicholas of Myra. But it reaches well further back into time. And I want to read this older story. We just heard a little bit from 1822 in that wonderful poem, but this is from a poem by Dickens, the great Christmas Carol. And I want to say this was written at a time in the 17th century. And this is really when the Christmas tree started coming onto the scene. In modern times, at least I should say. I mean, it just feels like this stream has been happening nonstop, but there's so much of the modern Christmas imagery. I mean, besides the consumerism and all that stuff, but in the story and even decorating a tree that has ancient roots, it seems, but historically we can only touch to the top of its branches. And so this was a very important time in the 17th century. I'm just going to read this short passage. This is from a wonderful book I really highly recommend everyone read. It's called The Winter Solstice, The Sacred Traditions of Christmas by John Matthews with Caitlin Matthews. They have a lot of really amazing texts about, mostly about kind of Celtic and shamanic traditions that are the roots of the current land we call the United Kingdom now. And our story actually goes here. To bring the story of the jolly old man up to date, we need to look back to the 17th century. Suppressed, along with the rest of the more secular Christmas celebrations in 1664 by the Puritans, Santa Claus reappeared amid much jollification in 1660 as the spirit of Christmas rejoicing, a role he was to adhere to brilliantly for the next 300 years, gradually transforming into the figure that we recognize today. Queen Victoria's German husband, Prince Albert, played a large part in this transformation, bringing a Teutonic element into the mix. At this point, Santa began to ride on a sleigh, to descend chimneys, and to fill stockings, just as he had in Germany in the prince's own childhood. Charles Dickens took up the reins in this period in his immortal Christmas Carol, which captured an image of Santa that was a blend of both old and new. Although he is ostensibly describing the spirit of Christmas present, there is enough here in which to recognize almost every aspect of Santa. So this is from Dickens. He was clothed in one single green robe or mantle, bordered with white fur. The garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare, as if disdaining to be warded or concealed by any artifice. Its feet, observably beneath the angle folds of the garment were also bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set here and there with shining circles. Okay, so cryptic, but let's get into the truth that here Santa's in green. All right, and this is like, well, and it's not Santa, it's the ghost of Christmas present, right? But I want to tie a couple things into this barefooted, kind of open robe, chest-bearing figure, and to the plump, jolly elf. This is somebody who's like in the plumpness, eating well during a time when food is scarce traditionally because of the cold and no harvest for a long time. And here we see this cat in green with the holly wreath that has basically twinkling stars and barefoot, and bare chested. He's warm in the midst of the cold. So I want to reach back into like older traditions where we celebrated at this time the great fight between the winter king and the summer king. And they have had many names, and we can hear about like the battles of the holly and the ivy and all sorts of things, okay? But it's interesting, but in the longest night, this is when the summer king wins. Because now the sun will slowly begin its climb. And at the time of the resurrection, the sun is now moving very fast, springing up to its solstice height in June time, when actually the winter king will take over as the sun begins to decline, though it's much hotter at that time of the year, right? So we see a little bit of this kind of summer king vibe going on here, but it's really important that this cat's dressed in green. We see the snow, right? The white fur. We heard that even a little more, or perhaps much more clearly from Clement C. Moore, where the beard is literally as white as the snow. But here, this green robe that's dressed in white fur, right? So the fur may be reaching into some of the animals, but I think very importantly, the snow itself. And so we basically see a man personifying the evergreen. So a really important tradition that reaches back to before herstory, is this idea of bringing evergreens into the house for luck, for fortune, for promise, for reverence of that which keeps its green even during the coldest hour, right? That which survives, unlike the deciduous trees which drop their leaves and have to have that whole compost thing, right? Green stays green. And so this is something to revere.
So it's a reminder of the strength of life to get through a harsh winter or to get through the harder times of scarcity.
Absolutely. And perhaps even that, even though most of the forest appears to die, some stand tall through it all. I mean, the tree teaches us to stand straight.
So people have been bringing evergreens into the home like long before Christmas for other celebrations or other reasons?
Yeah, definitely in Roman times, certainly like in the northern lands, right? In the Scandinavian countries, probably in like the Siberian realms. Like when we hear that this was part of Prince Albert's like German tradition, some of it's going to live there for sure. And we'll find our way to some of those, the gods of those lands.